The morning of August 12, 1943, aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress somewhere over German-occupied Europe, First Lieutenant Harry Crosby stood hunched in the cramped Navigator's compartment, his charts spread across the small desk, a pencil gripped in his hand. Through the plexiglass nose of the bomber, he could see the German landscape unfolding below patchwork fields, winding rivers, the industrial smudge of cities. The formation of more than 60 flying fortresses droned eastward toward the Ruhr Valley, each aircraft carrying 10 men and 4,000 pounds of high, explosive bombs. Crosby's job was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Navigate the formation to the target, keep them on course through flak fields and fighter attacks, bring them home. He had been doing this for weeks now, ever since arriving at RAF Thorpe Abbotts in June with the 100th Bomb Group. His crew trusted him. The group commander trusted him. 2,000 airmen flying in stacked formations across hostile skies trusted his calculations, his dead reckoning, his ability to find a pinpoint target in a continent at war. The mission briefing that morning had been routine. Primary target: an industrial complex in Gelsenkirchen, deep in the Ruhr Valley. Alternate targets if weather obscured the primary. Expected flak: heavy. Expected fighter opposition: moderate to severe. Expected casualties. The briefing officer never said, but everyone knew. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. Every mission cost planes, cost crews, cost friends. Crosby looked down at his charts again, then forward through the bombardier's position. The Ruhr Valley stretched to port Germany's industrial heartland, a landscape of steel mills and coal mines and factories churning out tanks and guns and ammunition. But cloud cover obscured everything, solid undercast from horizon to horizon. Without visual reference to the ground, they could not bomb. The technology for blind bombing through clouds did not yet exist, not in August 1943. They needed to see their target. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Navigator, what are your recommendations?" Crosby studied his charts. If the primary was obscured, they needed a target of opportunity, something visible, something valuable. He looked out again, searching for a break in the clouds. There, to starboard, perhaps 20 miles distant, a gap in the overcast. And through that gap, the outline of a city. Large, intact, undefended by the smoke screens that German crews lit when formations approached. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Crosby felt the weight of the decision settling onto his shoulders. He was 24 years old. 6 weeks earlier, he had been a graduate student in Iowa, studying literature, worrying about whether Jean Boehner would, quote, marry him. Now he was responsible for directing the destructive power of 60 heavy bombers onto a German city. Now he made decisions that would kill people. Enemy people, yes, but people, nonetheless. Factory workers. Families. The mathematics of industrial warfare reduced human beings to acceptable casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. He gave the pilot the coordinates, confirmed the heading. The formation began its turn, ponderous and slow, 60 heavy aircraft changing course in the sky. The bombardiers moved to their positions. Bomb bay doors rumbled open. The city grew, larger through the plexiglass nose. And then Crosby looked at his map again, checked the coordinates, felt his stomach drop as realization hit him with the force of flak concussion. He knew exactly which city lay below them, defenseless and clear in the gap of clouds. He knew, because the night before, after the pre-mission briefing, he had returned to his quarters at Thorpe Abbotts and played records on his gramophone. Beethoven's Third Symphony, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and while the music played, he had idly read the liner notes on the album cover, had noticed, without thinking much about it, that Ludwig van Beethoven had been born in Bonn, had attended school in Bonn, had spent his formative years in Bonn. The city below them was Bonn. Crosby's hand moved to the intercom switch. For a moment, he hesitated. What he was about to do made no tactical sense, made no strategic sense. The mission briefing had authorized bombing targets of opportunity if the primary was obscured. Bonn was a legitimate target, a Rhine River city, a transportation hub, a place of military value. Every other navigator in the 8th Air Force would release their bombs without a second thought. But Crosby was not every other navigator. He was a man who read liner notes, a man who cared about Beethoven, a man who understood, in that moment, that war demanded calculated destruction but did not require the annihilation of cultural memory. He pressed the intercom switch. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, despite the pounding of his heart. "We can't bomb Bonn." To understand why Harry Crosby's 4 words carried such weight, to understand why a single navigator's objection would halt the bombardment of an entire German city, requires understanding the world of the 8th Air Force. In 1943, a world built on doctrine, training, and the grinding mathematics of industrial warfare. The United States Army Air Forces had entered World War II with a revolutionary theory: daylight precision bombing. Developed through the 1930s at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, the doctrine held that modern warfare increasingly depended on industrial capacity: destroy an enemy's factories, disrupt their production, cripple their ability to wage war, and victory would follow without the need for the kind of grinding infantry, battles that had characterized the First World War. Air power, the theorists argued, could win wars decisively and relatively quickly. The doctrine was elegant. The reality was brutal. By August 1943, the 8th Air Force had been conducting bombing operations over occupied Europe for over a year. The results were mixed at best, catastrophic at worst. Daylight bombing required clear weather to see targets. It required tight formations to mass defensive firepower against fighters. It required navigators who could find pinpoint targets across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. And it required acceptance of losses that mounted with every mission. The men who flew these missions were volunteers, every one of them. After Pearl Harbor, young men across America had rushed to recruiting stations. Harry Crosby had suspended his graduate studies at the University of Iowa on December 13, 1941, less than a week after the Japanese attack. Like thousands of others, he chose the Army Air Forces, chose it for the adventure, for the technology, for the chance to serve in what seemed like a more civilized form of warfare than the mud and blood of infantry combat. The training pipeline sorted these volunteers into specialties: pilots, bombardiers, gunners, and navigators, men who showed aptitude for mathematics, for spatial reasoning, for the complex calculations required to guide an aircraft from one point to another across a continent. Crosby trained at Mather Field in California, learning celestial navigation, dead reckoning, pilotage, learning to use a sextant, a drift meter, a compass, learning to account for wind speed and direction, for magnetic variation, for the 1,000 variables that could send a formation miles off course. By May 1943, Crosby had completed his training and joined the 100th Bomb Group at Boise, Idaho. The 100th was newly formed, equipped with B-17 Flying Fortresses, 4-engine heavy bombers designed for high-altitude precision attack. The B-17 was an impressive machine by any standard. It weighed 32 tons fully loaded. It carried a crew of 10. It bristled with 1350 caliber machine guns for defense against fighters, and it could carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs deep into German territory. The 100th flew to England in May, arriving at RAF Thorpe Abbotts in East Anglia, a flat, muddy expanse of Norfolk countryside that would become home for the next 2 years. Thorpe Abbotts was a typical 8th Air Force base: concrete runways, Nissen huts for quarters, a operations building where crews gathered for pre-mission briefings. The base could accommodate 48 B-17 seconds, though losses meant the actual number fluctuated week to week. Crosby flew his first combat mission on June 28, 1943. The target was Bremen, a heavily defended port city on Germany's north coast. The mission was a baptism by fire. 3 B-17 seconds from the 100th were shot down. 30 men did not return. Crosby learned what every combat airman learned: that training was preparation but not prediction. that the theory of daylight precision bombing collided messily with the reality of German fighters and flak, and that survival was often a matter of luck as much as skill. He learned something else too. He learned that navigation was not merely technical, it was moral. Every course he plotted, every heading he provided, led men toward targets that would be destroyed, led bombs toward factories that employed workers, led high explosive toward cities that housed civilians. The doctrine emphasized precision military targets, industrial targets, infrastructure, but bombs dropped from 25,000 feet through clouds and smoke and flak often missed their intended targets. Collateral damage was a euphemism for people killed by bombs meant for someone else. By late July, Crosby had flown multiple missions and earned promotion to lead navigator. His role expanded. Now he was responsible not just for his own aircraft, but for entire formations. He planned routes, calculated fuel, requirements, coordinated timing. When the 100th flew the legendary mission to Trondheim, Norway, on July 24th, a 1,900-mile round trip that pushed the B-17's range to its absolute limit, Crosby navigated. When the formation needed to thread through German fighter zones and flak concentrations, Crosby calculated the safest path. His skill kept men alive, but skill was not enough. The 8th Air Force was discovering that daylight bombing without long-range fighter escort was unsustainable. German fighters Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf FDU 190 seconds attacked, formations in coordinated swarms. They had developed tactics specifically to counter the B-17's defensive armament, frontal attacks at high closing speed, striking before gunners could track them. Flak was equally deadly. German anti-aircraft batteries ringed every major city, every industrial target. At 25,000 feet, exploding 88mm shells could shred aluminum skin, sever control cables, kill crewmen. The losses mounted. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched simultaneous raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt Ball, bearing factories deep in southern Germany. The 100th lost 9 B-17 seconds over Regensburg. Other groups suffered similarly. 60 bombers failed to return from those two missions. 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The raids inflicted damage on German production, yes, but at a cost that made senior commanders question whether the doctrine was viable. Harry Crosby knew these numbers. He felt them personally. Every mission, he watched B-17 seconds fall from formation, trailing smoke, spiraling toward Earth. Every mission, he returned to Thorpe Abbotts and learned which crews had not made it back. Friends disappeared. The navigator he had trained with, the bombardier who bunked next to him, the pilot who had flown wing position gone. Replacements arrived, fresh from training, eager and terrified in equal measure. They flew a few missions, learned the grim realities, and then they too either became veterans or became casualties. This was the world in which Harry Crosby stood on August 12, 1943, staring down at a German city and making a decision that had nothing to do with tactical doctrine and everything to do with something harder to dose, quantify. Cultural preservation, historical memory, the recognition that some things, once destroyed, could never be rebuilt. That Beethoven's Birthplace mattered even in the middle of a war for civilization's survival. That humanity required not just defeating the enemy but retaining one's own humanity in the process. The other navigators in the formation could not see what Crosby saw. They did not know what city lay below. They would follow the lead navigator's decision because that was the system, the hierarchy, the doctrine. If Crosby called for bombs away, 60 bombardiers would toggle their releases. 4,000-pound bombs would fall toward Bonn, enough explosive force to obliterate city blocks, to collapse buildings, to create firestorms that would consume everything combustible. Or Crosby could say no, could refuse the target, could trust that his pilot would support him, that the group commander would understand, that somehow this one decision would not end his career or result in court-martial for dereliction of duty. It was, in every practical sense, an insane risk. Navigators did not override mission objectives based on personal sentiment. That was not how military operations worked. But Crosby believed in something beyond operational doctrine. He believed that the war was being fought to preserve civilization, not merely to destroy Germany's capacity to wage war. And Beethoven, whose music had consoled him the night before, whose symphonies represented the highest achievements of human creativity, Beethoven's city deserved to stand. "We can't bomb Bonn," he had said. Now came the moment when everyone else would decide whether to agree. The pilot's response came immediately over the intercom. "Roger, Navigator. We're bypassing this. Target." Just like that. No argument. No demand for justification. The pilot, whose name history has not preserved with the same clarity as Crosby's, simply accepted the Navigator's judgment. In the hierarchy of a B-17 crew, the aircraft commander had final authority. But effective crews functioned as teams, trusting each man's expertise in his own domain. The Navigator was responsible for finding targets. If the Navigator said they couldn't bomb this particular city, the pilot would trust that judgment. But the decision extended beyond one aircraft. Crosby was the lead navigator. The entire formation followed his heading, his timing, his target selection. When the lead B-17's pilot announced they were bypassing Bonn, every other pilot in the formation had to make a choice: follow the lead aircraft or break formation and bomb independently. They followed. All of them. More than 60 B-17 flying fortresses turned away from Bonn, some with bomb bay doors still open, bomb sites still trained on the city below. They flew on, searching for another target, while beneath them the city of Bonn remained intact. Years later, historians would debate what might have been lost if those bombs had fallen. The Beethoven house, the composer's birthplace, stood in central Bonn, the university where Beethoven had studied, the churches where he had played organ, the city's medieval architecture. None of these carried obvious military value, but all of them represented cultural continuity, the preservation of Europe's heritage, even as Europe tore itself apart. Crosby did not think in such grand terms in the moment. He thought about liner notes, about music heard in a Nissen hut on an English airbase the night before a mission, about the random accumulation of small knowledge, the kind of information you absorb without realizing it will matter, until suddenly it matters more than anything else. The formation continued eastward. 10 minutes later, they found a railroad marshalling yard near Cologne, clearly visible, obviously military in purpose. The bombardiers realigned their sights. Bomb bay doors opened again. The formation made its run. Bombs fell. The marshalling yard erupted in explosions and smoke. Mission accomplished, by the standards of operational doctrine. But the mission's real significance lay not in what was destroyed, but in what was preserved. Crosby had demonstrated that navigators, indeed, that individual airmen retained moral agency even within the rigid structure of military operations. They were not automatons executing orders without thought. They were human beings making human judgments, and sometimes those judgments required saying no to what would have been tactically acceptable. The decision was never officially recorded in mission reports. The 8th Air Force paperwork for August 12, 1943, notes bombing of a marshalling yard near Cologne as a target of opportunity. Primary. Target obscured by weather. Nothing about Bonn. Nothing about Beethoven. Nothing about a navigator's refusal. The official record, as is so often the case, captured the outcome, but not the decision that produced it. Crosby's crewmates knew, of course. Word spread through the 100th Crosby had called off bombing a city because of Beethoven. Some men thought it was brilliant. Some thought it was crazy. Edward Jablonski, writing about the incident years later in his book Flying Fortress, described Crosby's action as one of the strangest decisions ever made during the Second World War. Strange because it prioritized cultural preservation over military objectives. Strange because it succeeded without consequences. Strange because it revealed the gap between doctrine and practice, between what the manual said and what actually happened when human beings were given terrible responsibility. For Crosby himself, the decision became part of his identity. He was the navigator who saved Bonn, the man who proved that even in total war, Even in the grinding machinery of industrial conflict, individual conscience still mattered. He would fly 19 more missions before completing his tour. He would survive the war, return to graduate school, earn his doctorate, teach English literature. He would write a memoir, A Wing and a Prayer, that would become the definitive personal account of the 100th Bomb Group's experience. But on August 12, 1943, none of that future was assured. Crosby was simply a 24-year-old navigator who had made a choice and who now had to live with that choice's implications. As the formation turned for home, flying west across occupied Europe, threading back through fighter zones and flak fields, Crosby returned to his charts. Calculated headings, monitored fuel consumption. Did the work that would bring his crew and his formation safely back to Thorpe Abbotts. Below, in Bonn, people went about their lives, unaware that 60 heavy bombers had just overflown their city, unaware that bombs had not fallen, unaware that a young American navigator, listening to Beethoven records the night before, had decided their city was worth preserving. The war would continue. Bonn would face other raids, would suffer other damage. But on this day, because of this decision, the city stood. And, somewhere in those same streets, in a modest house that had been converted into a museum, Beethoven's birthplace remained intact. The rooms where he had composed his early works, the piano he had played, the manuscripts and memories of a man whose music had transcended his time and place, had become part of humanity's shared heritage. Harry Crosby, navigating by dead reckoning and conscience, had ensured that heritage would survive at least one more day of war. Harry Crosby's training as a navigator had been comprehensive but narrow in its focus. At Mather Field in California, from January through May of 1943, he learned the technical skills required to guide heavy bombers across hostile territory. The curriculum was intense: celestial navigation using star sights taken with a bubble sextant, dead reckoning calculations that accounted for wind drift and compass deviation, pilotage using ground reference points visible from 25,000 feet. He learned to use a Mercator projection chart, how to plot courses that accounted for the Earth's curvature, how to calculate fuel consumption against distance traveled. The instruments of his trade were simple but precise: a plotting board, a mechanical E6B flight computer, a circular slide rule that calculated ground speed, wind correction angles, and fuel consumption, a drift meter that measured how wind pushed the aircraft off course, a compass, charts printed on thin paper that covered half of Europe when unfolded, pencils that he sharpened constantly because accuracy mattered down to the millimeter when a millimeter on the chart represented half a mile on the ground. Navigation at 25,000 feet over enemy territory bore little resemblance to navigation in training. In California, Crosby had practiced over familiar terrain in clear weather with no one shooting at him. Over Germany, cloud cover obscured ground references for hours at a time. Smoke from burning cities created false landmarks. German fighters attacked at the precise moments when the navigator needed to concentrate on his charts. Flak explosions rocked the aircraft, sending pencils and instruments flying across the compartment. The B-17's navigator station occupied the nose section, just aft of the bombardier's position. It was cramped roughly 4 feet wide, 5 feet long, 3 feet of headroom when hunched over the desk. A small window on each side provided limited visibility. In combat, Crosby wore fleece-lined leather flight gear against temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero at altitude. He wore a flak vest overlapping steel plates, sewn into canvas, that weighed 20 pounds and protected vital organs from shrapnel. He wore an oxygen mask connected to a hose because above 10,000 feet, the air was too thin to breathe normally. The physical challenges of navigation were compounded by the psychological burden. Every course Crosby plotted led toward targets that would be destroyed. The briefing materials he received before each mission included reconnaissance photographs of German cities and factories. The photographs showed details: individual buildings, rail lines, roads. After missions, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the results. Crosby saw those photographs too. He saw what 4,000 pounds of high explosive did to the structures that had appeared in the pre-mission photographs. Buildings reduced to rubble, entire city blocks flattened. The 8th Air Force's doctrine emphasized military and industrial targets. Briefing officers stressed precision. Bombardiers trained to hit specific aim, points the center of a factory complex, the junction of rail lines, the engine works at the edge of a city. But precision from 25,000 feet through cloud cover and flak was aspirational rather than actual. Circular error, probable the radius within which half of all bombs would land, was measured in thousands of feet for high-altitude bombing. Bombs intended for a ball-bearing factory inevitably fell on the residential neighborhoods surrounding that factory. Crosby understood this, intellectually. He had seen the post-strike photographs. He knew that precision bombing was less precise than the doctrine claimed, but understanding intellectually was different from confronting the moral weight of that knowledge, different from standing in a bomber's nose compartment, looking down at a city, and deciding whether to direct 60 aircraft to release their bombs. The decision matrix he had been trained to use was tactical, not moral. Is the target militarily significant? Can the formation reach it with available fuel? Is visibility adequate for bombing? Can the formation defend itself during the bomb run? These were the questions navigation training had prepared him to answer. But on August 12, 1943, over Bonn, Crosby confronted a question his training had not addressed. What happens when a legitimate military target is also culturally irreplaceable? Beethoven's Birthplace was not a factory producing tanks or a rail yard moving supplies to the front. It was a modest house in a German city. It held no military value, but it represented something larger than military calculations could measure. It represented the continuity of European civilization, the recognition that the war was being fought to preserve certain values, and that those values included cultural heritage. The Army Air Forces had given Crosby no guidance on how to weigh cultural considerations against military objectives. There was no doctrine, no manual, no standing order that addressed whether cultural sites should be spared. The concept of protected cultural heritage would not be codified until after the war, when UNESCO was established, and the 1954 Hague Convention formalized protections for cultural property during armed conflict. In 1943, such questions were left to individual judgment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Crosby's judgment that morning was informed not by doctrine but by his background. Before the war, he had been a graduate student in literature. He read widely novels, poetry, philosophy. He listened to classical music. He cared about culture in a way that many combat airmen, focused on survival and mission completion, did not have the luxury of caring about. That background gave him a framework for understanding what Bonn represented. It also gave him the confidence to trust his own judgment over operational expediency. The immediate consequences of his decision were minimal. The formation bombed an alternate target. The mission was logged as successful. No one was court-martialed. No official reprimand appeared in Crosby's record. But the decision established a precedent, however unofficial and unrecorded. It demonstrated that navigators retained agency, that military personnel at every level of command could exercise moral judgment, that the machinery of industrial warfare, for all its momentum and doctrine, still depended on human beings who could say no when saying no mattered. The full significance of Crosby's decision would not become apparent until after the war, when Allied forces entered Germany and began cataloguing what had survived and what had been destroyed. In Bonn, the Beethoven house stood intact. The museum that preserved the composer's birthplace had weathered the war largely undamaged, despite the city suffering significant destruction from later raids that Crosby did not navigate. When American and British occupation forces established cultural preservation units, teams of specialists tasked with protecting and cataloguing Europe's artistic heritage, they found Bonn's musical legacy preserved. The house where Ludwig van Beethoven was born on December 16, 1770, remained. The rooms where he had lived as a child, where his prodigious talent had first manifested, where he had studied music theory and learned to play piano and violin, all of these spaces survived. The irony was profound. Germany, which had launched a war of conquest that devastated Europe, had seen its own cultural treasures targeted by the same industrial warfare it had pioneered. The Luftwaffe had bombed Rotterdam, Warsaw, London, Coventry cities with rich cultural histories, architectural masterpieces, irreplaceable artifacts. The German Air Force had shown little concern for cultural preservation when bombing Allied cities. And yet, when Allied bombers flew over German cities, some navigators like Crosby chose to preserve rather than destroy. The choice was not universal. Dresden, bombed in February 1945, lost significant portions of its Baroque architecture. Hamburg's firestorm in July 1943 killed an estimated 42,000 people and destroyed vast sections of the historic city centre. Berlin, subjected to repeated raids throughout the war, suffered damage to museums, libraries, and monuments. The cultural devastation was real and substantial, but some sites survived because individuals made decisions to protect them. In Florence, a German Wehrmacht officer named Gerhard Wolff, serving as consul, convinced Field Marshal Albert Kesselring not to blow up the Ponte Vecchio during the German retreat in August 1944. In Rome, the Vatican and other cultural sites were largely spared by both German and Allied forces through informal agreements. In Paris, German military governor Dietrich von Choltitz refused Hitler's order to destroy the city's monuments during the August 1944 liberation. Harry Crosby's decision over Bonn fit into this broader pattern of individual choices that preserved cultural heritage during total war. What made his decision particularly striking was its spontaneity. Von Choltitz had days to consider whether to follow Hitler's orders. Wolff had time to negotiate and persuade. Crosby had minutes, the time it took his formation to approach Bonn, recognize the city, make the decision, and turn away. The psychological weight of such decisions was immense. Crosby later wrote about the incident in his memoir, describing it with characteristic understatement. He did not claim to have been motivated by grand principles or humanitarian ideals. He simply noted that he had been listening to Beethoven the night before and could not bring himself to bomb the composer's birthplace. The casualness of the description belied the moral courage required. Consider the alternative scenario. If Crosby had not recognized Bonn, or if he had recognized it but decided operational doctrine took precedence over cultural sentiment, the formation would have bombed the city. 4,000 pounds of high explosive, multiplied by 60 aircraft, equaled 240,000 pounds of bombs, 120 tons of ordnance, falling on a city with no smokescreen, no significant anti-aircraft defences, no warning. The destruction would have been comprehensive. The Beethoven house would likely have been destroyed or severely damaged. The building was not reinforced. It had no special protection. A single 500-pound bomb landing within 100 feet would have reduced it to rubble. The museum's collection manuscripts, instruments, personal effects would have been lost. Beethoven's piano, the instrument on which he composed some of his early works, would have been shattered. The material connection to one of history's greatest composers would have been severed. That destruction would have achieved no military objective. It would have contributed nothing to defeating Germany. It would simply have been collateral damage in the pursuit of a target of opportunity, a railroad yard, a bridge, some structure of tactical significance that happened to be near Beethoven's birthplace. The war would have continued exactly as it did, but something irreplaceable would have been lost. Crosby understood this. He understood that some things, once destroyed, cannot be rebuilt. You can reconstruct a building, you can create a replica of a piano, but you cannot recreate the authenticity of the actual space where a historical figure lived and worked. That authenticity depends on continuity, on the physical structure surviving from the past into the present. Break that continuity, and you break the connection to history. The decision also revealed something about Crosby's conception of why the war was being fought. The Allied powers were not simply fighting to defeat German military forces, they were fighting to preserve civilization against a regime that had subordinated all cultural values to racial ideology and territorial expansion. If the Allies, in the course of defeating Germany, destroyed the very cultural heritage they claimed to be defending, what would that say about the nature of their war aims? This was not an abstract philosophical question. It was immediate and practical. Every time a formation of B-17 seconds approached a German city, navigators and bombardiers made decisions about what to bomb and what to spare. Most of the time, those decisions were constrained by doctrine, by weather, by tactical necessity. But sometimes, in rare moments when circumstances allowed choice, individual airmen decided what would survive and what would be destroyed. Crosby's moment came over Bonn. He chose preservation. The city's cultural legacy survived that day because one navigator, informed by a random piece of knowledge absorbed from an album liner note, exercised moral judgment in defiance of operational convenience. It was an improbable chain of causation. Beethoven to music, recording to liner notes, to memory, to decision, to preservation. But that improbability did not diminish its significance. In the decades after the war, the Beethoven House became a major cultural institution. Scholars from around the world studied its collection. Musicians pilgrimaged to the site where Beethoven had been born. Visitors walked through rooms that Beethoven had walked through, connecting, across 2 centuries, to the man whose symphonies had defined what music could achieve. All of this was possible because Harry Crosby, on a cloudy morning in August 1943, said 4 words: "We can't bomb Bonn." The mission records for August 12, 1943, preserved in the National Archives, tell the official story. The 100th Bomb Group dispatched 18 B-17 seconds as part of a larger 8th Air Force operation, targeting industrial facilities in the Ruhr Valley. Primary target obscured by cloud cover. Formation bombed marshalling yards near Cologne as target of opportunity. All aircraft returned safely to base. Mission logged as successful. What the records do not mention is the city that was not bombed. What they do not capture is the decision-making process that led to bypassing Bonn. What they omit is the human element, the navigator who cared. About Beethoven, the pilot who trusted his navigator's judgment, the formation that followed their lead aircraft without question. This omission is characteristic of military records. Official documentation captures outcomes, but rarely captures the reasoning behind decisions, especially when that reasoning deviates from standard doctrine. The paperwork shows what happened. It does not show why it happened, or what alternatives were considered, or what might have been. Reconstructing the fuller story requires looking beyond official records to personal accounts. Crosby's memoir, published in 1993 as A Wing and a Prayer, The Bloody 100th Bomb Group of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Action over Europe in World War II, provides the primary source for the Bonn incident. In the book, Crosby describes the mission matter-of-factly, without dramatization. He notes that he had been listening to Beethoven records the night before. He mentions reading that Beethoven was born in Bonn. He explains that when the formation approached the city and he recognized it, he told the pilot they should not bomb it. The simplicity of the account is striking. Crosby does not claim to have wrestled with difficult moral choices. He does not present himself as particularly heroic or principled. He simply states that he made a decision based on information he happened to have and values he happened to hold. The narrative suggests that any other navigator with similar knowledge and similar values might have made the same choice. But of course, most navigators did not have that knowledge. Most navigators were not listening to classical music and reading liner notes the night before missions. Most navigators were focused on survival, on completing their required number of missions, on getting home alive. The fact that Crosby had broader cultural interests, that he cared about things beyond the immediate tactical situation, made his decision possible. Edward Jablonski's Flying Fortress, the illustrated biography of the B-17 seconds and the men who flew them, published in 1965, includes a brief mention of the incident. Jablonski describes it as one of the war's most unusual navigation decisions, a moment when cultural preservation trumped military objectives. The account confirms Crosby's version. The formation approached Bonn with clear visibility. Crosby recognized the city and called off the bombing, and the formation proceeded to an alternate target. Other crew members from the 100th Bomb Group, interviewed decades later for various oral history projects, corroborated the story. They remembered Crosby as an exceptional navigator, someone who took his responsibilities seriously and who thought deeply about the implications of his work. Several mentioned the Bonn incident specifically, describing it as the moment when Crosby's character became fully apparent when his crew realized they were flying with someone who saw beyond the immediate mission to larger questions of meaning and value. The physical evidence supports the narrative. The Beethoven house survived the war. Post-war surveys of bomb damage in Bonn show that while the city suffered significant destruction from raids in 1944 and 1945, the area around Beethoven's birthplace remained relatively intact. Some of this was luck. Bombs fall where they fall, and the distribution is partly random, but the absence of major damage in August 1943, when Crosby's formation overflew the city with clear visibility and bombing capability, suggests that luck was augmented by intentional decision. The broader context of cultural preservation during World War II makes Crosby's decision less anomalous than it might initially appear. Throughout the war, on all sides, some individuals worked to protect cultural heritage even as the machinery of total war ground forward. The Monuments Men, Allied officers, tasked with protecting and recovering cultural artifacts, would not be formally organized until 1944, but the impulse to preserve culture existed from the war's beginning. What distinguished Crosby's action was its spontaneity and its individual nature. He was not following orders from cultural preservation officers. He was not executing a policy directive. He was making a split-second decision based on personal knowledge and personal values, in a context where operational doctrine would have supported bombing the target he chose to spare. The implications extended beyond one city, beyond one building. Crosby's decision demonstrated that even in total war, even in the most mechanized and doctrine-driven form of combat ever developed, individual moral agency persisted. The system did not eliminate choice. It constrained choice, channeled choice, made some choices more likely than others, but it did not remove the fundamental human capacity to look at a situation and decide, based on values that transcended doctrine, what the right course of action was. For the men flying in Crosby's formation that day, the lesson was clear. They were not automatons. They were not cogs in an impersonal machine. They were human beings with the capacity to make meaningful decisions. And sometimes those decisions required saying no to the target, no to the orders, no to the path of least resistance. Required trusting that preserving something beautiful and historically significant was worth the minor tactical inconvenience of finding an alternate target. The war continued. Crosby flew more missions. The 100th Bomb Group suffered terrible losses by war's end. It would have one of the highest casualty rates of any unit in the 8th Air Force. But through all the subsequent missions, through all the targets bombed and cities destroyed, the memory of that August morning remained. The memory of choosing preservation over destruction. The memory of Beethoven's birthplace, seen through clouds and spared by 4 words from a navigator who cared about more than just getting bombs on target. Harry Crosby continued flying combat missions through the autumn of 1943, accumulating the experience and psychological scars that came with repeated exposure to combat over German-occupied Europe. Each mission added to his understanding of what modern industrial warfare demanded from the men who fought it. He watched friends die. He navigated formations through fighter attacks that left the sky filled with burning aircraft and parachutes. He brought damaged bombers home, calculating fuel consumption down to the last gallon, finding fields in England through fog and darkness. The mission to Bonn faded into the background of more immediate concerns. Survival became the paramount objective. The 8th Air Force's losses continued to mount through the fall of 1943. The 2nd Schweinfurt raid on October 14th cost 60 bombers, 600 men killed or captured in a single day. The 100th Bomb Group earned its grim nickname, the Bloody 100th, through casualty rates that exceeded even the high averages of other groups. Crosby completed his combat tour in early 1944. By the standards of the 8th Air Force, he was extraordinarily lucky to have survived. The statistical probability of completing 25 missions, the required number for a combat tour in 1943, was less than 1 in 3. Most airmen were killed, wounded, or captured before reaching that milestone. Crosby defied those odds through a combination of skill, the competence of his crew, and the random chance that determines who lives and who dies in combat. After completing his operational tour, Crosby served as Group Navigator for the 100th, planning missions but not flying them. This staff position allowed him to see the war from a different perspective. He watched new crews arrive, eager and terrified. He planned routes for missions he would not fly. He attended memorial services for men he had known. The psychological distance between staff officer and combat crewman was measured not in miles, but in immediacy of threat. The war in Europe continued through 1944 and into 1945. Long-range fighter escorts P-51 Mustangs, capable of accompanying bombers all the way to Berlin and back, reduced the terrible losses of 1943. German air defenses weakened as fuel shortages and pilot attrition degraded the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. By early 1945, Allied air superiority over Germany was absolute. Bombers flew missions with fighter opposition that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Bonn survived as a city, though not unscathed. Later raids in 1944 damaged portions of the urban core. Allied ground forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, and Bonn fell to American troops with minimal fighting. The Beethoven house remained standing. When cultural preservation officers surveyed the city in the weeks after its capture, they found the museum intact, its collection preserved. The house where Beethoven had been born, where he had spent his childhood, where the foundation of his musical genius had been laid, all of it survived the war. The survival was not solely attributable to Crosby's decision on August 12, 1943. Other factors contributed. The city's location, the timing of later raids, the tactical decisions of multiple air commanders, the random distribution of bomb impacts. But Crosby's choice to bypass the city on that clear morning, when the entire formation had bombing capability, prevented one certain opportunity for destruction. That prevention mattered. After the war, Crosby returned to civilian life. He completed his doctorate in literature at the University of Iowa. He taught English at the university level, focusing on modern poetry and creative writing. He married Jean Boehner, the woman he had been courting when war interrupted his graduate studies. He built a career, raised a family, lived the ordinary life of a professor in mid-20th century America. The loss would have been significant, not because the Bonn decision changed the war's outcome, it did not. Not because it saved thousands of lives, it directly saved none, but because it illustrated a principle that mattered then and matters now. That human beings fighting wars retain the capacity to make moral choices, that systems designed to maximize destructive efficiency cannot eliminate individual judgment, and that sometimes the most meaningful decisions are the ones that choose preservation over destruction. In the 70 years since Harry Crosby stood in a B-17's nose compartment over Bonn and decided his formation would not bomb Beethoven's birthplace, warfare has become even more mechanized, even more systematic, even more dependent on technology and doctrine. Precision-guided munitions have largely replaced the area bombing of World War II. Satellite navigation has replaced the manual calculations that Crosby performed with pencil and plotting board. The physical distance between those who make targeting decisions and those who execute them has increased dramatically. Yet, the fundamental moral questions remain unchanged. What should be destroyed, and what should be preserved? Who decides? What values should guide those decisions? How do we balance military necessity against cultural heritage, tactical advantage against moral restraint, the demands of the moment against obligations to the future? These questions cannot be answered by technology or doctrine alone. They require human judgment, informed by values that transcend immediate military objectives. Harry Crosby, listening to Beethoven records in a Nissen hut at an English airbase on the night of August 11, 1943, could not have predicted that his casual absorption of a biographical detail from an album liner note would matter the next day. He could not have known that his formation would approach Bonn with clear weather, or that he would recognize the city, or that he would be faced with a choice between tactical convenience and cultural preservation. The chain of causation was improbable, almost absurdly so. But that improbability does not diminish the significance of what happened when all those improbable circumstances aligned. In that moment, Crosby demonstrated that even in the machinery of industrial warfare, even in the rigid hierarchies of military command, even in the fog and pressure of combat operations, even then, individual human beings could make choices that reflected values beyond doctrine, that preserved, rather than destroyed, that chose culture over convenience. We can't bomb Bonn. 4 words, spoken into an intercom over German-occupied Europe on a morning in August 1943. 4 words that spared a city, preserved a museum, protected a connection to musical genius that had transcended its time and place. 4 words that demonstrated the persistence of individual moral agency within the most mechanized form of warfare ever developed. 4 words that deserve to be remembered, not because they changed history's course, but because they revealed what remained possible even when systematic destruction seemed inevitable. The formation turned away from Bonn that morning, found another target, completed its mission, returned to England. The official records noted success. The unofficial history recorded something more important, that one navigator, in one moment, chose preservation. That choice, small as it was in the context of a war that killed millions and destroyed cities, mattered. It mattered to the museum that survived. It mattered to the visitors who would come in decades hence. And it mattered to our understanding of what human beings can choose to do, even in war, when circumstances allow them to exercise judgment guided by values deeper than doctrine. Harry Crosby saved Beethoven's Birthplace because he cared about Beethoven. The reason was that simple and that profound. In the midst of total war, culture mattered enough to one navigator to prevent its destruction. That decision, made in seconds and remembered for decades, stands as testament to the persistence of individual conscience, even when systematic violence seemed to have overwhelmed all other considerations. It stands as a reminder that we choose what we destroy and what we preserve. And those choices reflect who we are and what we value. And it stands as proof that sometimes, even in the darkest moments of history, human beings choose to save beautiful things simply because they are worth saving. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.